All right, so how do you control your lights? Well, the standard is what's called DMX, or digital multiplex. All right, and this has been around for decades. And it's what's used in, professional theaters. It's what's used by the pros. And the idea is that you have 512 channels of control. Now, to give you an idea of what a channel is, channel would be intensity. All right, so if you have lamp-based lights, okay, we call them hot lights because they run hot, they have one channel of control, intensity, right? 0 to 100% intensity, right? It's either all the way off, it's all the way on, or it's somewhere in between, okay? Assuming you have it connected to a dimmer, which is pretty self-explanatory, right? It dims the light between 0 and 100%. Now, without getting too technical, every channel has 255 steps, all right? So essentially 0 to 255 in DMX is mapped or is equivalent to 0 to 100% intensity, all right? Assuming that that's what you're controlling. With LEDs, you get multiple channels taken up by each fixture. And the reason for that is because now we have red intensity, we have blue intensity, we have green intensity, we have however many channels it takes. Maybe you have strobe, maybe you have color macros that you can call up and control. Maybe you have the ability to turn sound activation mode on. A moving headlight is at least 16 channels of control because you have pan fine, which is fine control. You have tilt fine. You have different positions of each color wheel, different positions of each gobo wheel. I mean, the list goes on and on. So with LEDs, you have to think about how many channels you need. With old hot lights, it was fairly simple. I have 8 lights, I need 8 channels, okay? With LEDs, I have 8 lights, I need 64 channels, right? So just understand what it is that you need in terms of control. Now, going back to DMX, okay? You can do it wirelessly or you can do it wired. If you want the best reliability, go wired. And the reason for that is because just like a wired microphone versus a wireless microphone, if you can have a physical connection, it is always best to do so. Now, wireless microphones have gotten to the point where they're pretty reliable. Maybe that's not been your experience, but in my experience, assuming that you've configured the system correctly, you've put the antennas where they need to be, it should work 95% of the time, all right? And the other 5% is going to be some uncontrollable circumstance of, maybe radio frequency that, is out of control from a local transmitter, batteries running out. There are different variables that factor into that, but by and large, they are reliable and they're becoming more and more prevalent and commonplace in, replacing handheld, at least, microphones for, worship or announcements. So, is wireless DMX where it needs to be? Well, there's always room for improvement, right? But by and large, I would say that within reason, do your research, you can be moderately safe going wirelessly. Just know what you're getting and know what the experiences are of other people that have used that system. Now, having said that, if you can run wires, carrying DMX to your fixtures, I would prefer you do that because, again, it's a much more reliable connection and it's impervious to RF interference and it doesn't have to frequency hop and, it's by and large going to cost you less in the long run. So let's talk about the connectors, okay? They look like a microphone connector. There's 2 different kinds. There's 3-pin and 5-pin. The DMX standard calls for 5-pin. However, only 3 of those pins are ever actually used. The standard has never been changed to take advantage of the additional 2 pins. Now, you might be thinking, well, 3-pin XLR, well, that sounds like a microphone cable. Well, yes, it does sound like one, but it's not the same. It looks the same, it wraps the same. Sometimes they use the exact same connectors, but it's the cable that makes the difference. The DMX spec, the specification, calls for a resistance or an impedance of 120 ohms. And this becomes very, very important when you're talking about very long cable runs. All right, so some shorter cable runs you can probably get by with 110 ohms. Just know that it's not technically within spec. Quick story of a personal experience that I had with this. I bought 1,000 feet of what was called DMX by the seller. It was made by a very reputable cable company or cable manufacturer. And I had 130 feet to get from the booth up to the platform. Okay, and from there, you know, it daisy chained through several lighting fixtures. Well, come to find out, it was not within the DMX spec. And that 110 ohm over short runs, like I said, probably would have been fine. But that long 130 foot initial feed run, or what we call a feed line, it would not work. It wouldn't turn the lights on, it just would not carry the information. So, you know, I was away from home. I didn't have time to order the right cable in. I had to go to a local supplier, and it cost me $900 to get the right stuff. So, you know, please learn from my mistake in my experience. Make sure you understand that you're getting the right cabling, and, you know, just double check. You know, if they don't list what the impedance is, call up the place that you're getting it from, call up the manufacturer, ask them about it, and make sure that it is 120 ohm. Again, if you're doing a long run. All right, so you've got everything wired up. How do you control these things? All right, so here I take a slight departure actually from my normal stance against software controllers and software being used in a mission critical environment. And a lot of the reason that I choose to do that is because the software is reliable. I've never had it fail on me. And it just tends to be easier to use for volunteers, which a lot of you are volunteers in your small church. Now, a hardware controller will work, but programming the lighting, okay? So if you just want to be able to turn lights on and off and maybe change colors, and you have a very small lighting package, maybe you've only got 4 to 10 lights, okay, fine, a hardware controller will work just fine. And you can have it in channel mode, okay? And what that means is channel 1 would say be red on fixture 1. Channel 2 would be green on fixture 1. You know, and it just corresponds directly with how you've addressed those fixtures. So with DMX, you have to set the address on the dimmer, okay, if you're using a conventional light or a hot light, or on the LED if you're using LEDs. All right, so the address is basically where it resides in those 512 channels that DMX has. All right, so if I set my LED to channel 100, right, and it's a 6-channel fixture, right, channel 100, 101, 102, 103, 104, 105. Okay, that's my 6 channels. All right, and I can put those back to back. I could put my next LED at 106, okay, for the DMX address. So just understand that you got 512 channels to play with, but you have to understand and notate where each fixture is located in those 512 channels. All right, hopefully that makes sense. And if it doesn't, feel free to shoot me a message, and I'll be happy to, you know, answer any questions that you might have. All right, so hardware controllers just tend to be more difficult to program. And what do I mean by program? Okay, so let's say that you want to move from, you know, just changing the color on your lights to actually creating cue stacks. All right, now let me explain that concept. So a cue is a look, okay? Maybe you want, you know, your backlights to be blue, you want your front lights to be white, and you want your audience lights to be red, okay? That would be a look or a cue. A cue stack is nothing but a series of cues stacked on top of each other that you can then activate in sequence. It's a very linear process. All right, some of the more complicated, say a big concert, you know, that you go to in an arena would have, I don't know, a dozen cue stacks, you know, probably more. And those things are those are programmed months in advance because they're very, very complicated sequences. for your needs, you just need to understand that if you want to get to the point where you're doing an Easter production or an Easter service and you want different lighting looks, you need to be able to program that. And that's where the software comes in very much ahead of the hardware controller. So we've been talking about lighting. Where do we put them? What kind of fixtures do we have to work with? So let's talk about the difference between conventional or hot lights, as I mentioned before, and LEDs. So first off is intensity. All right, so the hot lights are going to have, generally speaking, more intensity. That just means more light gets onto what you're trying to light. And the reason for that is because they also draw more power. And because they draw more power, they burn hot and they produce more heat. All right, and that heat oftentimes is transmitted down the light beam onto, in this case, me. And when you get a very brightly lit platform with conventional lighting, people tend to complain about the heat because now you've got, if it's very brightly lit, chances are you've got really high wattage fixtures throwing that heat down the beam, and you've got multiples of those. My old church, we had 24 hot lights for the platform. So now with LED, they don't draw as much power. They also don't have as much intensity, although that is starting to change, all right? They do have a higher upfront cost, but versus a, say, 2,000 hour lamp that you have to change once every other year, once a year, you know, times however many fixtures you have, okay, that's an additional cost that you have year after year. An LED is going to last you 50,000 hours. Okay, to give you a rough idea, if you were to run your lights and they were only rated for 20,000 hours, okay, and you ran them 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, every day of the year, they would last just over 3 years. All right, if you're using them on an average of 10 hours a week, 20,000 hours will get you well over a decade of use. All right, you can do the math yourself. It's very simple. So while they do have a higher upfront cost, they have a lower, much lower long-term cost because you don't have to replace lamps. You don't have to rent a lift to go and get to the light fixtures to replace the lamps. All right, so it's all about value, long-term value versus upfront cost. There are some pieces of equipment that are just better to pay for up front because they're going to last you much longer. So that wraps up this episode. Be sure to stick around for next week's episode, and we'll be talking about more advanced topics in terms of lighting and color and how to use shadow.
They're recording audio.